So what we're going to talk about in this video is where does proof for God's existence and for Christianity in general and things like that, where does that fit into people actually coming to Jesus? Now this is going to be a sister video to a previous video I did, which was how does the average believer know that God exists? But what I find is you actually get a lot of opposition from Christians on the question of God's existence. And the opposition especially for young people and for teenagers, or for more generally for the average person in the church pew, it's like, how do people come to know that God exists? How do the average person out there they'll say something like in the middle of deepest, darkest Africa, how can they come to believe in Jesus? And, that's a multifaceted question. So we looked at that in the previous video. But from more experienced evangelists, especially pastors and people who are oftentimes behind the pulpit or in some way a teacher or somebody in church, they have a more experienced question, and what they say is, based on their experience, people don't need proof to come to know God exists. They don't really know the proof, and they've shared the message of Jesus with so many people, and so many people have come to see that God exists or come to believe. Now, that's still relevant to the last video. In other words, the point I made in the other video about the average believer is that they actually do have proof. Everyone has proof. That's just the biblical point. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But what we're going to talk about in this video is just where does proof fit into your evangelistic efforts? Into where do you work that in? What role does that play in evangelism, going out sharing the gospel, telling people how to become a Christian, persuading people? So what we're going to do is, first of all, I want to point out just a few introductory things before we get into that. First of all, this is actually a secret that's kept from many atheists. Atheists out of the world, let me let you in on a little secret. You don't know this because in the forum of the church environment, it's very different from something like here on YouTube. Here on YouTube, I can have atheists comment on my video and tell me why they think I'm wrong. But typically in church, the dominant form of communication is from a pulpit. Most of the communication is done that way, and so it's just preaching at people, and there's no avenue for commentary or response or even asking questions or anything like that. So it can be very you can get away with just saying things and never having anyone question it, and so that goes on a lot. And so that is one of the most common places where you hear, don't worry about proof. Just take a leap of faith. Christians oftentimes will define faith in terms of believing in something without proof, which, as atheists will quickly point out, that's ridiculous. Because if that's the way, if you're going to say believe in Jesus, just because you just need to have faith, then what you're doing is you're empowering so many skeptical people out there, and oftentimes you don't realize that there are people in the pew who have doubts, and you're empowering those doubts with that kind of talk, because that is ridiculous, irrational talk, and it needs to stop. Just have faith is ridiculous. Why couldn't just have faith in what? Do you not think that, Muslim terrorists who blow themselves up for Allah have faith? Clearly they believe they have faith. So, that in no way does that help anything. But when you're preaching from a pulpit, you don't get questioned, and you get to say whatever you want as long as you get the pulpit. And also in the circles of Bible study groups and that kind of thing, oftentimes you can get away with saying things because people it's not comfortable to question the truth of Christianity, the truth of the Bible, the truth of God's existence in those circles. And so you can say things like just have faith, but just have faith is ridiculous. Just have faith in what? Okay? Alright, and this is a secret that's kept from many atheists. I think really the atheists and the skeptics of the world who say, you know what, you don't have proof, there's no proof, many Christians have simply bought into that. That's what's going on. Many Christians have simply bought into that, and they've bought this atheist tagline. So oftentimes the best kept secret is all the proof that we have. I mean, when we do have proof, why should we avoid it? Or why should we not know it? But it's fascinating. The gymnastics that people will do mentally to avoid the proof. And I think it's because they bought atheist lines. Now, atheists, if you ever confront a Christian in real life, you are a switch. Whether it's online or whether it's in, person, they will completely switch how they talk to actually, because you're there, they can't get away with the nonsense that goes on at church because you're actually going to challenge them, and they can't just say, just have faith and, you just need to make this leap of faith. Sometimes they will, because you have, this particularly ardent, Bible study lover, but this is typically a best kept secret from atheists. What's preached from the pulpit can be oftentimes more ridiculous. And there's plenty of atheists out there who are ex-church members or ex-Christians and that kind of thing, so they know what I'm talking about. So it's not totally a secret. Now, like I said, we're going to build off the other video. So what we're going to do in this video is really, when we talk about where proof fits in to people coming to Jesus, is really we're going to define how Christian apologetics works, just kind of the overall general function of where apologetics fits into the whole thing. This video, not only does it build off what the previous video said, but it also even builds off the verses, the very verses that we covered in the previous video. We're going to go right to the next verses. And the verses in Romans 1 that we used Romans 1, 18, 19, and 20 in the last video. And in this video, we're just going to go to Romans 1, 18, 20 through 23. Okay? So the next three verses, we got 3 verses and then 3 more verses, and they're going to build off one another and help us make sense of all of this. Now, the last video and the last verses, what we talked about is, not only is there proof for God's existence, but what the Bible tells us is that the proof is clear and obvious. Okay, so first of all, if you were one of those people who says, just have faith, believe without proof, I want to point out that is unbiblical. That is not according to the Bible. Not only is that unbiblical, but to recap the last video, the proof is obvious according to the last video. And so the point we made in the previous video is that because the proof is obvious, everyone has access to it. Everyone. And what we went into great detail talking about in the last video was, well, how on earth does it make sense? Why doesn't everyone, just believe, and why doesn't everyone, why isn't everyone able to just, spit the proof out? If you ever ask a Christian for proof, they ought to be able to spit it out. And we talked about that in the last video, so I encourage you heavily to take a look at that last video. But let's just assume that for the sake of this video, let's take a look at the, people who reject it. In other words, if there's proof all around you for God's existence, and it's clear, blatantly obvious proof, all right, now, follow the logic of those verses. If, just assuming for the sake of understanding what the verses would imply, that those verses are true. Romans 18, 19, and 20. It says, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Clearly seen God's divinity, God's godhood. Okay. So that everyone's without an excuse. Alright, so if you reject that, if you decide, you know what, even though I know this to be the case, I don't like that it's the case, I'm going to decide I don't think it's the case because this is what I want to be true. If you take the road of insanity, then where will that lead you? Now, first of all, a lot of Christians throw up excuses and they say, well, this is, this is just atheists, if you don't know, this is another trick Christians use in Christian circles. They say you can't have proof because if you had proof, then no one would be able to make a choice whether or not they believe or not, which is another irrational escape. I mean, that's just irrational. There are so many people who believe insane things in this world, and to say that insanity and the ability, just the simple ability to reject what you know to be true, this is fascinating that you would go there to avoid the whole question of proof. You've obviously bought the atheist tagline, Christians, that there's no proof. you've been sold a bill of goods that's just not biblical. It's just, clearly I could give you proof. I've got other videos. We're not even going to talk about it in this video, but there's proof. The bottom line is there's proof. So, this is the thing. People don't have to accept what they have been shown and proven to be true. They don't have to accept it. It's a fact of life. It would be nice if life didn't work that way. It would be nice if everyone was reasonable and rational all the time. But the number one complaint in this life is that other people are unreasonable. That's the number one complaint all the time, that someone else out there is being unreasonable and won't listen to the facts and refuses to make sense, and they're stubborn and they're pig-headed. That's the fact of life. We're stubborn jerks. Think about it. I mean, other Bible verses even talk about this, but things that are clearly blatantly obvious facts of life. There's a whole Twitter page dedicated to this. I think it's a bunch of Twitter pages. It's like a meme going through the internet of like me, something like exercise and eat healthy. Enter me. Krispy Kreme is running a sale on entire 24 cases of donuts. So that's the fact of life, that we know what to do and we don't do it. We know that it's wrong and we agree that it's wrong. And if someone else was to do it, we would be quick to point out that it's wrong. So the fact of the matter is, people have the ability to reject what they know to be the case. That is a fact of daily life. And if you want a more hard-nosed philosophical proof for that, then, if it's just the obvious facts you just aren't able to convince you, then think about this. I guess another obvious fact is, I guess there would be no such thing as insanity then. There's nobody who walks around thinking that he transforms into a penguin every night, or there are no crazy people, right? Because, why would you believe something that you clearly know not to be true? Why would people lose touch with reality? There's no crazy people. Every crazy person is correct. Okay, but no, let's get into the more hard-nosed. One thing that we clearly have proof of is uncertainty. Think about it that way. But there are many times in life where we are certain of things when we really shouldn't be certain. Where we decide that, oh yeah, I know that this is the case. When in reality, you don't know it's the case. And that's a fact of life. You've done that. You've done that. Where you've been honestly, you believed that this was the case. But then it wasn't the case. Well, then you were irrational. You were unreasonable because you should have at some point said, I think it's probably the case. Okay? So that's just a real fact. If you have free will at all, then you would never be mistaken about anything ever. We would never be mistaken because we would always say, this is my best guess in this situation, but possibly I'm wrong. We would never be unreasonable. So anyway, let's put that one to rest. Why would you, that would make life so simple if everyone was just reasonable. And then, so if in life, if the evidence clearly indicated X, you would just give people the evidence and they would, go with X. But life's not like that. People are unreasonable, and no one would ever believe in something unless they had, real good reason, unless it was proven absolutely true. And they would be willing to be persuaded all the time until they had absolute certain proof. So no one would ever believe a lie, ever, because lies can't be proven true. So if you've ever believed in a lie, ever, and actually believed it to be true, then you're proving my point. Okay, so this is the issue. If there's proof for God, just if the Bible verses are true, if there's proof for God and it's obvious, then think about the mental state of someone who, what the Bible says is everyone rejects God. Okay? So, it's not that we reject the proof, it's that we reject God. And this is what Paul says in verse 21, following up, when he talks about the proof and how it's obvious, and he says, no, everyone has no excuse because we all have the proof. And then he says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God, nor gave thanks to Him. So, people rejected God. Okay, now think about that. think about getting out of bed every morning with that mindset of knowing God exists, knowing that you're a sinner, knowing, as Paul says, the wrath of God is being revealed for your sinfulness, and just deciding you are just going to be hard-headed and don't believe in it, even though it's obvious every day. Okay? And if you don't think it's obvious, we explored that in the last video, but we're just going to assume for this video that the Bible's true here. There's my phone ringing. I'm back. Okay. So, we've explored it in the last video, and in this video we want to explore the mindset of someone who says, you know what? It's not true because I decided it wasn't true, even though I know it's true. That's a hard-headed mindset. So, what people do, what would you do in that situation? Well, you become a very angry, ferociously, emotionally intense, hard-hearted person. Okay? Paul says, he follows up and he says, but their thinking became futile thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. You become dark-hearted, hard-hearted, because you refuse to accept what is obviously true, because you don't want to glorify God or give thanks to God, because you don't like God. Okay, now, this is the thing. This is where apologetics comes in. It's not easy to go through life like that. This is not this is ridiculous. Like, how could you go through life with that kind of just stubborn, angry attitude? If you could find a way to rationalize your disbelief in God, you could make yourself feel smart. Okay? In other words, like some sort of thing that confuses and blurs the issue to make yourself feel smart for not believing in God. Now you can, if you can really convince yourself, then you become this person who's feels safe. Instead of, if you can, instead of, having to be hard-hearted towards the obvious wrath of God, now you're just like, I've convinced myself. I've rationalized it away that that's not something to worry about. That's nonsense. And that's exactly what Paul says. He says, the next thing he says, you're hard-hearted, but people move into, he says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. So in other words, you make the fundamental reason that people reject Christ is because of a heart condition at the core of everything. They don't like God, according to what Paul says here. They don't want to glorify God or give thanks to God. So the hearts become darkened in futile thinking, in empty, pointless thinking. But they claim to be wise. So, in other words, it's at the core, the problem is emotional. But people don't stay there. That's a very difficult place to live life from just an angry, dark heart. So what people do is move it into an intellectual space where we claim to be wise, where we try to make ourselves feel smart for rejecting God, even though we knew God, and the proof was obvious. We didn't like God, and we didn't want to accept God. But that's a hard way to live, so we try to find a way to feel wise for not accepting God. But in reality, as Paul says, he says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. And so, what Paul's saying here is, people reject God for emotional reasons primarily, but they move it into an intellectual space. They move it into head reasons, into brain reasons. And that becomes a defense mechanism so that you can go through life as a normal person who's not crazy and angry all the time. But you're just, just a normal, rational person, and you can feel good about yourself. What's more, and this is kind of what I was talking about in this video in terms of the intro, you can actually go around confusing people who believe in God into thinking that God doesn't exist, or something like that. Now, the person who believes in God feels, instead of feeling safe and smart and confident and overall just right, they feel unsafe for believing in God. They feel unconfident for believing in God. They feel stupid for believing in God, and they feel wrong for believing in God. So it's a way of turning the tables. The proof is clearly on the side of belief in God. And the person who rejects God should feel upset about that, but they're just having a hard-headed attitude, and they're just pig-headed about it. But instead, they dang, there's the phone again. Sorry about those interruptions. Okay, so people move it into a headspace. You follow what I'm saying? Move it into a space where, hey, I'm smart. I'm doing the right thing here, for not believing in God. And what they do is they turn you into what they are. In other words, now you, the Christian, are the one who's wrong if you're fooled by this stuff. If you're fooled by what appears wise but's really foolish, as Paul says. They're claiming to be wise, but they're really fools. If you're fooled by that, then you will be the person who's just hard-headed and just refuses to give up your belief in Jesus, even though the evidence is all against you. Okay. So, and Paul even talks about, he says, although they claim to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. In other words, he's saying this is where all other religious practice comes from. And that makes perfect sense. In our day, it's become more about atheism. But the point is, belief in God, it gets replaced by some other religion that, people would rather to be the case. But now, you've got this whole religious system, and if it can build off generations of say Hindus or something, then you feel like it helps you convince yourself that, like, hey, yeah, I don't need to worry about that Jesus stuff. We've got this long history of, our religious traditions. We've got our Bibles and our books. So there's no reason we need to accept it. And it's a way of avoiding the fact that, like, well, this was obviously true. And, your thing is obviously wrong. But, it's set up in such a way that it sounds almost right, and it makes you feel smart, and, and a big fancy word for it is obfuscation. A way of just saying a bunch so that it sounds like you can hide the fact that what you said was stupid. Okay. But, oh my goodness, with the phone. Oh boy. The phone is ringing off the hook. The people don't want me to make this video, I guess. The devil. So anyway, I'll call all these people back. I promise we're going to finish this video. So anyway, where were we? Well, the point is, this is where apologetics comes in. Apologetics is Ravi Zacharias, he calls it bush clearing. Maybe it's because he's from India with all the jungles. But he says, the goal of apologetics, you don't really convince people to come to faith, but you remove the stuff that's grown up around Jesus. They've planted all these shrubs and bushes, basically all the intellectual sounding confusion around Jesus. And your job is to come in there as an apologist with a machete and just cut all those bushes down so that, oh, look, there's Jesus. He was right there the whole time. but you're just kind of clearing the junk that people built up around Jesus. That's not going to make people accept Jesus. Rather, it's going to get to the heart of the issue, which is the heart. And so when you're doing apologetics, what'll happen is people will be very calm, very reasonable with you. You'll debunk all of their atheist ideas. And the reason people are atheists is because what we find is societies that are Christian, they can't go to some other religion. They have to go to atheism. So it's sort of a post-Christianity phenomenon, which is very telling that, after Christianity, there's no God for you left. You can't really find a God to replace Jesus. You can't find a better concept. But anyway, what happens is you give people proof, and they get more emotional and more angry and more upset and less receptive to what you have to say. Because you remove the defense mechanism and you got to the heart of the issue. At that point, the apologetics stops, and you just got to give people a big hug. At the end of the day, it becomes about a big hug at that point. Because it becomes an emotional issue. And the only thing that's going to, resolve the hard heart is when people see the love of Christ in the story of Christ, in your life, or someone else, but most importantly in Christ speaking directly to their heart. So that's kind of the gist of it. Apologetics serves a very important role in people coming to faith, and it's absolutely vital. So that's why I kept making this video and kept making these points, even though the phone wouldn't ring. If you want another metaphor for this, the one I like to use is a kid who doesn't want to get out of bed, and they're just hard-headed about not wanting to get out of bed. They just want to stay in the bed. So what they do is they don't want to accept the fact that they have to get out of bed, so they pull the covers over their head. And it's all dark under the covers, so it's still nighttime, and I don't have to get out of bed. And when in reality, they know full well that it's daytime. And they're just hard-headed about it. But if they can pull the covers over their head, and it can be dark under the covers, then they're able to feel like, oh, it's really nighttime, and convince yourself that it's really nighttime. And so your job as a Christian apologist is to come and yank the sheets off the bed. Okay? So they can see the light. Oh, the light. Yeah. Pun slightly intended. Okay. But that's not going to get them out of bed. The fundamental problem is the heart condition. But oftentimes what you need to do is deal with the intellectual stuff so you can get it's the barrier they've built to protect them, to protect the hard heart from the love of Christ. And so you want to remove that barrier. You want to come out there with your bush clearing tools, get up all the trash, and then we can deal with the hard issues. Okay. So, one final point is what I've been told from someone who's very experienced in Christian apologetics is typically in churches there's like one guy who does Christian apologetics, and he's like the only guy. And the lonely apologetic soul. And what you find as a Christian apologist is most of the time you're dealing with Christians and you give them apologetics and proof to help them become more confident, and then they can go out and, because a lot of times people don't share their faith, and one of the primary reasons they don't share their faith is because they don't want to be challenged. They don't want to have anybody commenting on their videos. They don't want to hear responses. That's the 4th time the phone has ring. It hasn't rung in 4 days. It's amazing. Okay, so anyway. This was the best time ever to call me all week. I think I haven't gotten any phone calls, like 1 or 2 all week, and then we got 4 during this video. Anyway, so this is the goal of apologetics. A lot of times is like, most of the time when you're going out sharing your faith, you're not going to be doing apologetics. oftentimes you might have to do it sometimes. You share it, but then it's really, you move on past it, because when people come to faith in Christ, it's something unique for every person. But one of the more important things about apologetics is it's about empowering Christians to, if the confusion that the pagan world or the skeptical atheist world or whoever out there, if the confusion they build up, if it makes them feel safe, smart, confident, and right, then and Christians hear it, and apologetics doesn't remove it, then it will make the Christian feel unsafe, stupid, unconfident, and wrong. And so apologetics turns the tables back. So now we've got a bunch of Christians, once we do apologetics with them, and now they're going to feel safe, smart, confident, and right. And that doesn't mean they're going to go out and try to, attack everyone, but they need that. They need that when they go out. And apologetics, can even affect just Bible study in general. When you know that the Bible's actually true and that God really exists, that might affect how seriously you take what it says about how to live your life. So there's tremendous benefits to doing apologetics, and it's very sad that, people are against it. So it fits in, but oftentimes it's something that sits in your back pocket. You just know that it's true because you have the proof, and you might want to, as a spiritual discipline, review it every once in a while. But for the most of the time, you don't really need to talk about it. It's just like, oh yeah, it's clearly true. Now let's move on to something else. But it can have a powerful effect on a Christian congregation when they realize that, like, hey, this stuff is actually really true. We're actually right. Then maybe I should take this stuff more seriously. It can have that effect. And it can also have an effect on how scared you are when you go evangelize. Because most of the time when you go evangelize, you won't have to give proof, but it helps you to know that if you need to, you totally have it. So in light of all that, I recommend you check out my Proof God Exists playlist. You may have found this video in that playlist. It will be in that playlist. I will link in the description to the previous video, How Does the Average Believer Know That God Exists? Which, links to that question of, like, how do people in, deepest, darkest Africa, etc., come to believe in Jesus, etc., etc. But anyway, this video has taken long enough with, I think, 4 phone calls. And we're going to stop right there. Thank you for your time.